So, are we really all in this together? I would argue absolutely we are. In fact, so would my guest today. He wrote a new book called We're All in This Together, Creating a Team Culture of High Performance, Trust, and Belonging. Came out in April. It's a fantastic book. His name is Mike Robbins. He's the author of 5 books. And for the past 20 years, he's been a sought after speaker and consultant who delivers keynotes and seminars for some of the top organizations in the world. He's been featured in New York Times, Harvard Business Review, NPR, ABC News. He contributes to Forbes. He's got his own weekly podcast. And get this, his books have been translated into 15 languages. Thankfully, I only speak one. It's English. We're going to talk about that today. What's up, Mike? How are you?
I'm good, Phil. Yeah, I only speak one as well. So we're on the same page there.
That's good. You didn't translate all your own books? I'm kind of disappointed.
I did not. Every now and again, I'll get one sent from the publisher, and it'll just be the book, and I don't know what language it is. So I'll usually take a picture and post on social media and say, hey, anybody, what language is this? And then people start chiming in. So it's kind of funny.
That is funny. Yeah, that's really funny. Wow. So cool, man. So this being your 5th book, right? You got a lot of a background here and leadership and team building and stuff. But one of the things you talk about in this book is the fierce urgency of now, the right now. So why is it so important to be so focused on the right now?
Well, it's interesting, Phil. Like, I didn't actually even want to write this book, to be honest with you. I wrote a book called Bring Your Whole Self to Work that came out in 2018, and I was done with that book. It was my 4th book. I love my work. Writing books is not my favorite thing to do, to be perfectly honest with you. And when I finished, I was like, okay, good. I'll take a few years before I write the next one. And like 3 weeks later, I got a download. This is, summer of 2018. You have to write another book. It has to come out in 2020 called We're All in This Together. And if you'd seen me walking down the street, you would have thought I was a crazy person, because I was like looking up at the air like, no, thank you. Go find somebody else. I don't want to write another book. But I say that because it just felt to me, and the book is really about teamwork and about culture but it also, just in terms of what's been going on in our country and our world over the last number of years, felt to me like I want to write something. I want to be talking to people about how do we find common ground? How do we come together? I say that all as a preamble to, I wrote this book in 2019. I finished it up towards the end of last year, knew it was going to come out in 2020, had no idea it was going to come out in the midst of a global pandemic, in the midst of a historic reckoning around racial injustice and other issues. But what I wrote about in the introduction was what Martin Luther King talked a lot about, was the fierce urgency of now. Like, we have to address what's going on right now, whether it's in our families or our teams or our country or our world. And really, at some level, not just when we're in a pandemic, but if we're going to be able to succeed collectively, we really are in it together. And whatever we need to do to get into that mindset is so important if we're going to be able to be successful.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting, right? I know that books take a while to gestate. So any of the books that have come out in the first 9 months of 2020 kind of are magical. And by that, I mean, so many of them are so timely that if you could have predicted that they'd have come out, that you'd be like, really? Like, we need a pandemic to make this make even more sense. And then what do you know? Here we are. So really interesting how you kind of got that download, and how, like, right now it matters even more than ever that we are in this together. So much cooking around, so much on that. But how has that kind of shaped the way that you talk about things? Because as you said, man, you didn't predict this. So how is what's happening right now? How has that changed? Or maybe it hasn't changed the way you talk about your book.
Well, it has, in the sense that, look, I mean, there's another metaphor that I like. It's interesting, when the book came out back in April and when we were just getting into the pandemic, the phrase "we're all in this together," so many, whether it was political leaders, whether it's people in the media, people in business, I was literally getting emails from, every company I do business with, the CEOs were sending out, and the title would be "We're all in this together." But what was interesting is people started to push back a little bit. And even some conversations I had with people like yourself here would say, wait a second. Are we really? Like, this is impacting people in a different way. And so I believe that, yes, we're all in this together. And I really like the metaphor of we're all in the same storm, but we're in different boats. Because the reality is we're all collectively dealing with this sort of global circumstance, but it's impacting people in different ways. And both of those things can be true. So whether you're a leader, whether you're a parent, whether you're just a human being interacting with other human beings, it's important to remember that we're all dealing with this pandemic. We're all dealing with different aspects of what's going on politically, socially, otherwise, but we have our own unique circumstance. So the age of our children, if we have children, the health of our parents, if our parents are still alive, the nature of the work that we do. Some of us are able to do work really easily virtually, even if we're missing being in the office and being with people. Some of us literally can't do our work. If you work in a in hospitality or in live events or things like that, where it's like, whoa, this has been completely impacted. Retail, especially in the early days of it, that's very different than if you work in technology or other places. So understanding that, when I'm talking to leaders right now, a lot of what they're dealing with is trying to support their team members and their fellow leaders, just dealing with, kids going back to school or not going back to school or doing school at home or whatever, that doesn't really have anything to do with the work, but has everything to do with people's lives.
Yeah, I think that's important, right? That we're all in the same storm, but in different boats, different spaces, different places. And one of the things that you talk about is the 5 things that make it difficult for us to work. And the 4th point that you make is we're often separated by time and space. And this is more true now than ever. So how do we kind of explain that? And then how the heck do we overcome that? Because we're not in the same space and we're often asynchronous. Right. So how do we overcome that now, man?
Well, yeah, I mean, I talk a lot about why teamwork is challenging because, we're not trained to work in teams. It's difficult. But this notion of being separated by time and space, if you and I were having this conversation 6-8 months ago, it's a challenge that a lot of people face in the world we live in. It's wonderful we have all this technology. You and I can have this conversation. I'm sitting in my office, you're sitting in yours, but we're at home. The challenge is that we can work from anywhere. So we're not all in the same building. And then with the pandemic, most of us can't go in and be in the office. Or if we are, we have to stay away from each other. We have to put on a mask. It's all this stuff. So in some ways, and I've been saying this to a lot of teams and leaders I'm working with now, in many ways, it's even harder than ever for us to collaborate and work together today. And it's probably more important than ever because, in some ways, I was talking to an executive the other day with a technology company, and they're based in Silicon Valley. They have people, of course, all over the world. And she said something interesting. I said, how has this been for your leadership team during this time? She's like, well, it's been really challenging, but in some ways, it's been kind of a nice equalizer. Because for all of our leaders that are in the different regions that constantly have to deal with time zones and everyone's in the office in Silicon Valley and then we're out in the right regions, it sort of puts everyone on the same level playing field. Because whether, I'm sitting in my home office here in the San Francisco Bay Area, someone could be in New York or Chicago, or they could be in London, or they could be in Tokyo or whatever. And yeah, we'd still have to deal with the time zone difference. But the reality is, again, we're all dealing with, I'm at home trying to work. So in some ways, it makes it harder, but there is also a way in which it can ironically sort of bind us together because everyone's in that same situation.
Yeah. Same situation, right? But different time, different space, all of that. But equalizing that is fascinating because I'll tell you, I moved to Florida because I wanted to be in the Eastern time zone. I find that that's kind of the money time zone that we work in. And it's so interesting because, this time, in many ways, it has equalized. But in other ways, those of us on the East Coast now we have to work longer days. Yeah. We've got to work now from kind of 7 to 7 because that's really only 7, that's really only 7 to 4. Right. And really only 10 to 4 if we really think about that. So really, really interesting that you would bring that up and think about how that is. But it also allows us to do more independent work, which great leaders know that delegation, trust, authority, right? Passing that down, that's really important. So how, by being in this together, how by, kind of having that same, opportunity, if you will, to do this, how does that help a leader lead a team that might be cross time zones even more effectively now?
Well, I mean, again, I think it's a challenge for sure. And what I think will be interesting is to see what do we keep from this experience as we move through it. I mean, I think we're learning that there are some things we don't need to be together in order to do, right? Independent type work, as you're talking about, certain conversations, certain meetings, certain things. Oh, that can be done just as effectively remotely as if we're all together. And certain time gets wasted when we're just literally standing around the water cooler, shooting the breeze. However, we're also learning that certain things get missed, and all of the unstructured time that happens when we are in the office or we can spend time together and we can really go deeper in our connections with each other. So back around to sort of answer your question. I mean, I do think right now is one of the most challenging times for leaders, but an incredible time for growth. And, I talk a lot about growth mindset in my work. And I love this notion of, when something happens that's difficult, instead of asking the question, why is this happening to me or to us? Just changing the word to the word for, and say, why is this happening for me or for us? It doesn't mean we love it. It doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean it's not challenging. It means we look for the opportunity for how we can learn, how we can grow. What's hard about a situation like this is we're still in the middle of it. Usually it's easier to look at that in hindsight. Oh, now I see how I learned from that, or I grew from that, or how that made me better or stronger, or us. The challenge is because this is prolonged, right? Are we in the middle of this? Are we still at the beginning of this? Are we towards the end? Nobody knows, right? We don't know how long this is going to last. So what we have to be able to do, as challenging as it is bring that growth mindset on a daily basis, and still acknowledging, I think it's important to acknowledge when things are challenging or hard, but not from like a whiny, complainy, blamey kind of way, but just from a real, authentic, taking ownership perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. One of those things that you mentioned that makes this difficult is the fact that we focus so much on ourselves, right? Our own situation, what our challenge is. And as a leader, we really have to, we know it's hard. Let's be clear, right? Mike and I are not suggesting this is all simple and easy and no problem, but we are suggesting you have to look outward and you have to say, okay, so maybe this is even harder for Mike. Maybe Mike's situation makes it even harder. So how do we shift that focus, man? Because I think that inward from outward is often hard, especially being in the middle of a pandemic. We've got, kids at home, older parents, potentially, as you said, sick. Maybe we got sick. Right. Our energy level isn't what it was. The gyms are closed. We can't go there. Right. All the food that I expected to get, right? Fresh is great, but it doesn't keep. And if I don't want to go to the grocery store every single week, like maybe I did before, that's tough. So how do we move that focus, man? How do we get out of our own way?
Well, I think it's a balance, right? I mean, I do think when you think about leadership in life, right? Emotional intelligence is so important, right? And what's emotional intelligence? Self-awareness, self-management. So there is an aspect of caring for myself, even using the metaphor I was talking about earlier, the same storm, different boats. It's important to take care of what's going on inside of our own boat. That said, we also, as leaders and as human beings who care about other human beings, can we pay attention to what's going on inside of other people's boats? And that's the other part of emotional intelligence, social awareness, relationship management. So it's a time where I think we really have to double down both on caring for ourselves and caring for other people, which again is not easy to do in normal circumstances, even more challenging. But I do think, it's the biggest cliche ever, but it's, put your own oxygen mask on first. So care for yourself, but then at the same time, be mindful of and aware of what's going on for other people. I do think, like in my house, so my wife and I have two girls who are 14 and 12. And, like every other family, we're fortunate, those of us that are fortunate enough to be healthy and be together and be safe. And we love each other and we drive each other crazy. And we've never spent this much time together as a family. And I would say at least once a week, if not almost on a daily basis, one of us, if not more of us, are melting down in some way. So we have to figure out how to dad's having a bit of a meltdown, I got to move through that and get some support and love. And okay, now mom, okay, now, whatever. And that's the same with teams. That's the same with organizations. Like the emotional roller coaster of this thing is pretty intense. And although maybe we're getting a little more used to it, it's still abnormal. I mean, this whole thing, and I don't say this to make an excuse, feels like being in an altered state. And I keep saying to my wife, Michelle, babe, when we get done with all of this, we're going to look back and go, that was insane. Even though we know it is now, I think we'll realize it even more on the other side of it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's a reason that they call it the novel virus. Is that because we've not seen this in our lifetime, maybe in a couple of lifetimes. So super different times. And with that, being aware of ourselves, being aware of others, but also one of the pillars that you talk about is creating the psychological safety to make it okay to experiment, right? To make it okay to be like, crap, I don't know. So talk to me about what is psychological safety? What does it mean? And what makes it so hard to actually do that? Because as much as I can say it, sometimes I forget it. I knew I forgot it this morning, and I'm probably going to have to make it up to my sweetheart pretty shortly here.
Of course. Well, look, psychological safety is essentially group trust. It means the group, whether we're talking about a team at work, whether we're talking about our family, whether we're talking about any group of human beings that come together, the group is safe for what? For taking risks, for making mistakes, for disagreeing, for not being perfect, obviously, even for failing. Not that we want to, but we know that we can do those things in a group that has psychological safety. Any of those things are possible. And I know I'm not going to be shamed. I'm not going to be ridiculed. I'm not going to be kicked out of the group. And this isn't just a warm, fuzzy, touchy-feely thing. This is like Google did a study a few years ago that I referenced in the book called Project Aristotle. They spent 3 years studying what does it take for teams to create high performance. They brought in researchers and scientists, and they did a ton of really deep scientific research on this because they want to figure out, like, how do we get our teams in the best position to succeed? And after 3 years of studying, what they came back with was some findings. And the number one, by far most important element of team performance they found was psychological safety. And when I interviewed Karen May, who at the time was the head of learning and development at Google, about the findings from Project Aristotle, I said, were you surprised by any of these findings? And she said, we weren't surprised to know that this thing called psychological safety, or basically group trust, was important. What we were surprised by was how important it was. Like, basically, if a team has it, they have a chance to be successful. If they don't, no matter how smart and talented all the members are, it's almost impossible for them to really perform at a high level. So it's hard to create that and to continue to nurture that. But for teams, for leaders, when you think about, okay, how do we respond when someone fails? How do we respond when someone has a dissenting opinion? And can we continue to make it safer and safer for people to speak up and really be themselves? Because if that's the case, then people are really going to be able to engage and perform. If we're constantly walking on eggshells and worried about being judged or ridiculed or making sure we have to fit in or be liked all the time, it's difficult for us to perform at the highest level.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Right. If we're going to be criticized, everything we say, well, I'm just going to pull back. I'm not even going to play. I'm not even going to put my chips on the table. So with that, though, it's important to be authentic, right? We can't just be a shiny, happy, positive person. That doesn't work. That toxic positivity is as bad as anything.
Right.
But I love where you talk about self-righteousness with your wife. You have to share that, because I thought that actually made me laugh, and I've done that, and I'm sorry, Stephanie, that I have. So
yes. Well, so the way I define authenticity is, right, it's honesty without self-righteousness and with vulnerability. And the story I share in the book about self-righteousness, because self-righteousness can be like, we're arguing and I'm saying you're wrong, and usually it's more subtle and often passive aggressive, if you will. We do it with people we love. We do it with people we work with. So the example that I share, a few years ago, Michelle and I were in the car with our girls, our daughters, Samantha and Rosie, who, like I said, are now 14 and 12, but this was 2-3 years ago. So they were a little bit younger, but we're backing out of the garage, and we were in Michelle's car, but she asked if I would drive, and I said, sure. And so we're backing out, and the cars are pretty tight in our garage, so you have to be careful when you back out. And this particular morning, for whatever reason, it seemed like her car was parked really close to my car and kind of almost at an angle, and I'm backing out, and I'm starting to get worried that I'm going to hit my car. And I stop in the middle of my struggle, and I turn to Michelle and I say, hey, babe, if you park the car just like this, and I start explaining to her how I park the car and what I look at it. And as I'm explaining this, Rosie, our younger daughter, who was 9 at the time, is sitting in the back seat right behind me. She says, hey, dad, stop mansplaining to mom. To which I was first impressed that she knew what mansplaining was. I'm like, you go, girl. But I'm like, hold on a second. I was not mansplaining to mom. I was simply and I look at Michelle and I look at Samantha and Rosie, and all three of them are like, yes, you were. And I stopped and realized, oh my gosh, I was. What was I doing? Right. I was uncomfortable with the situation. It wasn't set up exactly the way I would have set it up. So I decided that was the appropriate moment for me to coach my wife on the proper way to park the car in the garage. Right. And I often, when I share this story with people, I say, how many of you can relate to either side of this scenario? And of course, everybody can. Usually one side maybe more than the other. But I said, you're probably not surprised to hear that Michelle was not sitting in the passenger seat saying, thanks for the feedback, babe. Anything else? No. Right. Because look, the natural response to self-righteousness is defensiveness. Now, that's not to say that we can never give each other feedback, right? Let's just say, for the sake of argument, maybe I had a point, right? But I could approach it in a different way. Hey, I'm struggling, which was true. I'm having a hard time with this. I could have asked Michelle, do you ever struggle with this? Does this ever happen? And maybe she says, yeah, I know. Why is that? And then we have a very different conversation. Or maybe I say, hey, I have a suggestion might make this a little bit easier because I'm having a hard time here. Are you open to that? Yeah, but maybe she says, no, this is never a problem for me. I have no issue. Then we have to realize, like, oh, you say potato, I say potato. Like, it's not an issue for her. It's an issue for me. At that point, there's no reason to give that feedback, right? Because even if we say it nicely, what I was basically saying in that moment, and I love Michelle, I respect her. She's amazing. She's brilliant. But I was basically saying, I parked the car the right way. You parked the car the wrong way. That's the underlying message. And the response, none of us, look, unless you're literally, the house is on fire or you made just a blatant mistake and you need to be corrected, we don't respond well to being told that someone else is right and we're wrong. That's not the way we're going to be able to give feedback and really build trust. Even if we really disagree with each other, there's a way to disagree about the idea without doing it self-righteously that makes the other person wrong. Because even if we're factually correct, the other person naturally is going to defend themselves against the righteousness. And then we lose, doesn't matter about the argument per se, we lose the relationship in any communication we're trying to have.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I got a lot to learn there. I'm going to have to reread that chapter. That's a pretty good one, man.
Let's just say it's a lifelong journey. It's a process. And what we also need, Phil, and this is where teamwork comes in, relationships come in. We need people around us who can point it out. Even like my daughter Rosie, right? To see our blind spot. Because the truth is, when you and I are being self-righteous, we don't think we're being self-righteous. We just think we're right.
Yeah.
And we live in a culture, unfortunately, that is obsessed with rightness and proving other people wrong. I mean, this is one of the dangers of social media, right? We get on social media and it's like, this is what I think. And if you don't agree with me, you're an idiot, and it's like, that's not a really healthy way to have a discussion about something, especially about really important issues. And we create these little echo chambers of people who agree with us, not just about politics, although we can see it that way clearly, but this happens inside of organizations and families in a really detrimental way.
Yeah, it sure does. It sure does. And it prevents your next point in the book, which is that focus on inclusion and belonging. Because frankly, if I'm always wrong, well, I don't even know that I want to be part of that game.
Right.
I don't even know that or I might say, well, Mike, you always make me wrong. Therefore, I'm not going to invite my friends because I might need this job, but you know what? I'm not going to put anybody else through this crap. So how do we shift that around, man? How do we get to more inclusive and belonging when we want to always be right?
Well, we have to, first of all, we have to confront some of this stuff within ourselves, right? As we're talking about, but also look at the things that we do and say consciously or unconsciously that might get in the way of that inclusivity or that belonging. The truth of the matter is, look, we're all biased. And there's conscious bias, the ones we're aware of, and then there's unconscious bias, which we don't even know. We don't know what we don't know. The other aspect of this that I talk about in the book, and this is obviously a hot button issue in our culture today, but it's really important, is to be able to acknowledge our privilege. And there's one of the things that I found when I was researching this, I thought it was such a great example, a high school teacher who explained how he teaches his class about privilege. He said, what I do is I pass out a piece of paper to everybody in the class, just a blank piece of paper, scrap paper, and I say, crumple it up in a ball. He said, I put a garbage can in front of the class, and I say, okay, this garbage can represents success, making it in our culture, right? So all of you have an opportunity to make it as a metaphor. So what I would like for you to do, sit in your seat with your crumpled up piece of scrap paper and throw your, crumpled up ball into the can. And if you make it into the can, you made it. If you miss, sorry, good luck to you kind of thing, right? And he said immediately what happens is the kids get kind of excited, but then right away, the kids in the back of the class start complaining. Wait a second, hold on, this is not fair. The kids up front have an easier shot. And then he stops everybody and he says, yes, okay, look, let's talk about this. Clearly, everyone has an opportunity. So you can make it from anywhere, but is it easier if you're 5 feet away from the thing in the front row versus in the back of the class on the side? Yeah. He said, and most of you up front, it's not that it's a slam dunk. You still have to pay attention and make the shot. He said, but your first thought sitting up front probably wasn't like, oh, I'm so lucky I'm in the front row. It was like, how am I going to make the shot? And so he said, and then notice who's complaining the most. It's the people in the back. And so he said, I end the lesson by explaining that education is a privilege. Not everybody gets an education. And you get to choose what to do with your privilege, right? And he makes it in that sense. It's not so much about race. It's not so much about class, although obviously that's a lot of what we can look at with privilege. And the reason I share this, Phil, is because when I first started really thinking about and hearing about and hearing people talk about privilege, in my mind, what I thought was like, oh, privilege is like if you're a Rockefeller. Privilege is like if you have a silver spoon in your mouth and like, your parents give you millions of dollars or you inherit the family business or whatever, right? And that is part of it, but that's an extreme example. All of us have privilege as men, as white people, as whatever we are, whoever you are. And you may not be male or white or straight or like I am on that level, but we have privileges like we can walk and we can talk, or we live where we live, or we have access to the internet or whatever. And the reality is part of inclusivity and belonging is owning up to, not apologizing for the privilege that we have, but understanding it and owning up to it and remembering that, oh, maybe not everybody has the same privileges that I do. So I don't have to walk on eggshells. I don't have to apologize for it, but I do need to be aware, back to that same storm, different boat thing, right? That it's like, oh man, I hate working from home. Well, like some people aren't working at all right now.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And that doesn't make your stress about working from home less valid. But what it does mean is like, oh, maybe let's pay attention to what other people are dealing with. Or again, you have a coworker who's got 4 young kids and they're trying to figure out how to get these kids fed and taken care of and to school and whatever, Zoom school, whatever. And again, that doesn't mean nobody's wrong, nobody's right, but it's just different. Or again, are certain, little innocuous things that we do in business. I see this happen a lot. And I'm a huge sports fan. So to me, I'm always included in conversations about sports, but hey, did you see the game? Or what do you think about LeBron and the Lakers and about it? Right. And it's like, okay, not that we, but like, how about people who don't care about that or don't know about that or from a different country or whatever? It's like, you know what I mean? Just like, hey, you start making golf references or football references. And it's like, that doesn't actually, not only does that not help, in some cases, people are sitting there going, well, I'm not part of this group because I don't know what the heck that's about. And we do that with good intention, but we don't realize the impact that has sometimes.
Yeah, I totally agree. I got made aware of those sports cliches a few years ago. One of my friends said to me, she said, not all of us like football, dude.
Right.
Like every program that you have does not need to include, hey, let's score a touchdown. Hey,
right.
Get down in the red zone. It's like,
right.
Oh, duh.
Well, and in some ways, even with that, because so I'm a former baseball player, right? I played baseball in college and then played professionally. So sports was literally my life from the age of 7. I stopped playing at the age of 25. And not only did I play baseball, I played basketball, and I'm a huge sports fan. Some sports more than others, but there's very few sports references unless you're going to like talk about cricket or something. Like I'll be able to follow the analogy, even if it's like, well, I'm not a huge hockey fan or I'm not a huge, volleyball fan, but I get it enough. That said, traveling around the world in over the last 20 years and being in different places, using my story from playing baseball as a big part of kind of how I talk about things, I am really mindful. And what I try to do, and this isn't necessarily the perfect way to do it, but if I'm somewhere, or I'll even make some caveats. Listen, I know some of you may not care about baseball at all, or might think it's boring, or might not know anything. Okay. But then I'll try to share an example from it. And I had a woman actually, to your point, come up to me about 10 years ago after a speaking engagement. And she said, you got up and they introduced you and you started talking about baseball. And I immediately rolled my eyes and went, oh, here's another man talking about sports. It's going to drive me crazy. I hate this. She's like, I hate sports. I really hate baseball. And she said, but I actually appreciated what you said and what you shared. And I said, really? She said, because you didn't use analogies or make reference to things. So like I had to know the ins and outs of the game or certain players or teams or any of that. She's like, you told stories. And so the context of your story just happened to be you were a baseball player. She said, but I could relate to your story because it was more of a human story. And I appreciated her saying that because I hadn't thought about it consciously, but it's different. If we use an example, it's okay to use a football example as long as you communicate it in a way that like, I don't have to know anything about football to understand it. Because otherwise it's just like making a reference to a song or a movie or whatever without dumbing it down. If I go, remember in Good Will Hunting when blah, 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 and someone's like, I didn't see Good Will Hunting. How old are you? What are you talking about? Do you know what I mean? And it's like, you have to be able to be all of this. I'm talking about it in a communication standpoint, but if we want to be inclusive, this isn't about the word police, but it is about thinking about how is what I'm going to say or do going to land for people who may not be like me, who may not look like me, who may not like the same things that I like. And that's not easy to do, but it's super important to do.
Yeah, absolutely. As a leader, it's our job to share that context, not just the content.
Yes.
And that's super important, right? That's because really if it was just as easy as sharing 9 things to do, well, heck, we wouldn't need books. We wouldn't need
Right.
experts. We just say, okay, here's the 9 things. See you later. Right. This is
Right.
how it works. But that isn't how it works. And
Right.
with that, right, as we kind of wrap this up here, Mike, one of the things that I think is super important that you mentioned in your book, that we're all in this together, is the idea of a stop, start, continue.
Yeah.
And that is really big when it comes to things you can start doing right now. And that is start adding more context to whatever it is you're saying. So talk to us about the stop, start, continue and how valuable that is as we work to working together.
I love this technique. I learned it years ago, but it's basically, these are 3 questions we can ask in different contexts. Think about it like this. Like, so say you're a manager and I work for you, and you would say to me, hey, Mike, what could I stop doing that I'm currently doing that maybe is getting in the way of me being successful or being an effective manager? To you, what could I start doing that I'm not doing? Again, that just in general for more success or our relationship to what can I continue doing? So looking at stopping, starting, and continuing, these are questions we can ask for feedback from others. We can even ask other people to ask us in a one-on-one setting, in a group setting. I've facilitated this exercise with groups many times, and it's a little scary. It's a little intimidating, but basically everybody's on sort of the hot seat for a few minutes, but they get feedback from the whole group. And usually, if you set some context, people can really get into it and do it in a meaningful, kind, but direct way. It's also another thing. Sometimes I'll ask these 3 questions of myself if I want to make some changes. What could I stop? What could I start? What could I continue? Sometimes if I'm working with a group, even in this virtual Zoom world, at the end of a session that we have kind of a discussion as a group, okay, what are we going to stop? What are we going to start? What are we going to continue? So the group can really think about making changes. So I like these questions as prompts for ways that we can either give or receive feedback one-on-one or in a group, or also make some changes.
Yeah, awesome. I think that's really important. It slows us down to find out what other people think and what they need. And if we ask the stop, start, continue questions, and then really listen to that feedback, don't be so self-defensive and say, whoa, hold up. Here's why I do those things.
Right.
Which is a great thing that my teenager does all the time. She likes to defend herself on that, right? If we slow that down and instead say, that's good feedback. Okay.
Yeah. And along those lines, I'm sorry to cut you off, but remember, feedback is just feedback. We take it on, try it on like a shirt. If it fits, if it's valuable, if we can use it, take it. If not, we can let it go. The defensiveness often, usually our response to feedback is either shut up, like defensive, or, I suck, I'm bad, like something's wrong. Where we want to get to, and I talk about this in the book, is that place of, wait, what? Get curious. What did you say? What do you mean? What? Because that's where we can learn from it. Now, again, you might give me some feedback and it's not valuable ultimately, but if I immediately stop you and get defensive, or if I immediately go into that sort of self-critical, the negative place, I'm not going to hear the feedback. But if I consider it and go, I never thought of that, Phil. Let me think about that. And maybe I think about it for a few days and I go, yeah, no, that's not really going to help me, but Phil's whatever. But at least I took it in. Or maybe I think about it and go, you know what? That's really an interesting point. I never thought of that. And then I can do something with your feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. And it respects the person, which is really important. I mean, that's the big thing out of feedback, to your point. It's just data.
Yep.
It's just, consider or not, it's really up to you. So I dig that. So any last points, Mike, about your book, right? We're all in this together. It's a great book. It's super helpful. Lots of good stuff in there. Any final points or any ways to get started on the journey, Mike?
Look, I mean, thanks for having me. I appreciate having this conversation. Look, I think right now what's necessary for all of us is just to have as much compassion as we possibly can for ourselves, for the people we work with, for the people in our lives, in our families. Like, I don't mean to sound overly corny, but I feel like everybody's doing the best they can. We're all doing the best we can. We're in unprecedented times. Again, it's not an excuse. It's just the reality. And so the more compassion we can have, the better.
Yeah. Awesome. That's a great way to wrap it up. Have compassion for others, be understanding, forget about putting yourself in other people's shoes. Just have compassion for them. Let them be, because you have no idea what the heck is going on there. So
that's true.
Great way to bring this home. So folks, if you want to get more from Mike, you should check him out at mike-robbins.com. Mike, I really appreciate that you took some time for this conversation today. Lots of good stuff there. Congratulations on a great book. And again, thank you for sharing as much as you did. I really appreciate it, man.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure.